So here we have Johnny Depp returning with magic potions, because nothing kills pirates like magic potions. He destroyed cities. He was a bad man. If you're Spanish. If you're British, however, he's very useful. Hello, I'm Iszi Lawrence. I'm a historical children's author. I wrote this book, Blackbeard's Treasure, and I'm here to tell you about whether I think that these films about pirates are accurate or not. And already we have a problem, because that is not an accurate British noose. That is an American noose with the coils going up. British ropes had an eyelet at the end, so you just thread it through just once, and that would do.
A state of emergency is declared for these territories.
Okay, so let's start off. Pirates were not hung in the Caribbean until later into the 18th century. They would be taken back to Wapping, where they'd be executed there. So they'd be tried at somewhere like Port Royal, and then they'd have been taken back to London to serve as a warning to other pirates. The trapdoor, this was standard drop. Short drop would be thing under this. This is a standard drop of 4 to 6 feet. Later on, obviously replaced by the long drop, which is a much more effective way of hanging. So basically, if you're being hanged like this, what you want is to be as fat as possible and as heavy as possible. They're going to show a kid in a minute, I think. But the kid is in a standard thing. I don't know if this drop will be enough to kill him, so he'd probably be there with a slightly fractured vertebrae dangling for ages. I mean, the phrase "pull my leg" is actually because of hanging. So you want your friend to come along and just pull on your leg to break your neck, so you're not left there struggling and gasping and being slowly choked.
King and his men stole the queen from her bed and bound her in her bones.
Now this song, entirely fictional. The colours refers to a flag. Usually it's the king's colours, meaning, you know, what we would call the Union Jack. But the colours would be the black flag that you fly to scare people. Obviously, if you fly a red flag, that means you're going to kill everyone on board. Now, sailing songs obviously very important, because you want to have everybody in time when you're doing things like hoisting rigging.
Hoist the colours high.
I think actually the way that rope's to the side of his neck is accurate. That's where it would have been put. The eyelet would have been just under the jaw as well if he was actually, you know, being hanged in the British fashion. That's definitely an American noose, which I do not approve of, because this is pre-America. Come on. And they weren't also hanged in mass, as far as I know, like this. There would have been regular hangings at Wapping. Famously, Charles Vane, who was a really brutal pirate, saw Captain Kidd being executed because he was local to Wapping. So that's in London. And hangings were an event. People used to go to them. You used to be able to watch it. The whole idea was that it would put you off being naughty, but actually it was just entertainment for people. I mean, people genuinely enjoyed it. It's something so strange to us now. We think we probably want to vomit or something, but, you know, people would be there watching it, you know, finding it great fun.
I call on Captain Teague, keeper of the code.
Sri Sumbaji proclaimed this all to be folly. Hang the code. Who cares?
So you did have pirate councils. This happened. Pirate captains had to make agreements, find out what each other were doing, make sure they weren't annoying each other too much, make sure they didn't attack each other. So you have people like Jennings and Hornigold having massive arguments at Nassau, trying to establish who was the most dominant, who should we follow. I think Blackbeard and Charles Vane, there's a bit of rough and tumble about who's going to take the king's pardon, who wasn't. So these meetings did happen. I mean, pirates did meet. Also, they wanted to swap crew members and everything else.
Morgan and Bartholomew.
And yeah, the pirate code being represented as a sort of Bible is completely stupid. I'm sorry, filmmakers. It makes a great story, the idea that they all recognise this mystical book, but that isn't what the pirate code was. It was a simple agreement that you made, boarding a ship, agreeing to be a pirate. You might swear to honour the code that you've all mutually agreed. Things like, if you get injured, we'll call a doctor. Everybody has a vote that's equal. We all have to be in agreement. Once the vote's cast, we're doing what we all say. We're not going to mutiny, that sort of thing. You each get this sort of ration. Captain gets this much, the crew gets this much. Usually not as disparaging or disparate as the difference between the Navy, what the Navy captain gets compared to what the crew member gets there. But all of this sort of written code nonsense. Yes, it would have been written out. There were written codes, but they were like a page, not a book.
I call for a vote.
But the idea actually of having a vote, that is very piratical. They were very democratic, more democratic than we were today. A ship's boy was allowed to vote. A black person was allowed to vote. A woman was allowed to vote. If they were a member of the crew, you had a vote. And that vote was equal to the captain very often. And that's how you didn't get mutinies, because you didn't need to mutiny, you just needed a vote. And they did have welfare as well. You'd have a system of welfare. So that, you know, everybody got a pension, if that was the case that you could afford it. If there was treasure, it was shared. And it was far more egalitarian than anything of the time, or even anything that came years, decades later in the American Revolution or the French Revolution. They were so ahead of their time. Women pirates were definitely real. They weren't very common. Now, a lot of women pirates, like Mary Read, were dressed up as men. And you wouldn't know they were women pirates unless they told you or they came out later on. So we don't know exactly how many women pirates there were, probably more than you would imagine. But obviously Anne Bonny, famous female pirate in the Caribbean in the early 18th century, she captained a ship. She also went out with Calico Jack and basically called him a dog when he refused to fight because he was too cowardly, famously. But it was rarer for women to be pirates. Similarly, it was rarer for women to do anything other than basically stay home and, you know, give birth and work as servants. It wasn't much fun.
I vote for a man, of course.
Capitaine Cheval, the penniless Frenchman.
Sisumbaji votes for Sisumbaji.
Mistress Ching.
Gentleman Jocard.
Elizabeth Swan.
Barbosa.
Villanueva.
So you had pirates like, I think it's called La Bousse, who it literally means the buzzard, and he was a famous French pirate. You had Dutch pirates, you had Spanish pirates, you had English pirates, you had Maroons, who were like people like Black Caesar. We don't know their nationality. Maybe they were African merchants. More likely, Black Caesar was a Maroon slave. He could have been from he could be in Nigeria, from Mali, from Central Africa. He could have been, we don't know where he came from. He could have been a slave in, you know, North Carolina. He could have been a slave in Hispaniola. You know, he could have been anywhere. So we don't know. So many different nationalities were going on at the time. And also remember, like, all of the African people there were all speaking their own languages, which are very different, you know, so they couldn't communicate easily. They weren't one homogenous group of sort of black people. They had their own national identities, and they knew, you know, the people who speak Twi would have been different to the people who spoke Yoruba, and this is where you get these exciting languages like patois starting to be born in places like Jamaica. It's because you have this mix of languages and people communicating in a way that everybody can understand, even if they don't have English as their main language.
The ship is ours!
Okay, so this is Blackbeard's introduction scene. So I presume we're on the Queen Anne's Revenge, which was definitely, it's an ex-slave ship called La Concorde and was not covered in skulls. And here we have Blackbeard coming out of his cabin. Now, I portrayed Blackbeard as in his cabin a lot because he was ill. However, Blackbeard was 38 when he died, and life has not been kind to Ian McShane here. He is far, far too old. But anyway, it is fantasy, magical pirate stuff. He has wonderfully got his hair in braids, that is accurate. He is all wearing black, which also is accurate. That's how I portray him in Blackbeard's Treasure. He has not got the brace of pistols on, which is, you know, fair enough. But he would have had a brace with 4 loaded pistols on him to be as scary as possible. Also, he had red ribbons in his beard as well to be ultra scary.
Sailors abandoned their posts without orders, without leave. Men before the mast.
And yeah, he wasn't able, funnily enough, to command the rigging just by use of his eyes, apparently, and twirling of his sword there. But the Queen's Revenge was a real ship, and Blackbeard managed to get it simply because when he found La Concorde, it was adrift pretty much because the crew was sick. It was a slave ship. Most of the slaves were sick, and he offered them a chance to, goodness, what a silly sword that is. I don't think that's a realistic sword. It's just very like an open flame again. The worst thing, the most scary thing on a pirate ship, if you were being attacked by another ship and you had an open fire on board, you'd be more scared of the open fire on board than you would be of the enemy ship because, yeah, that can really, really spread. And if you're on a wooden vessel in the ocean, you don't want it. Funnily enough, it's not historically accurate that the rigging would come alive and suspend pirates like flies in a spider's web. That is not accurate. Also, the Queen Anne's Revenge, I don't think it had the double balcony quite that way. But, you know, in terms of size of ship, roughly right. It was a big tall ship, Queen Anne's Revenge. But that is not the best depiction of Blackbeard I have ever seen. Blackbeard, why would you attack your own crew? If they wanted to mutiny, they could just vote you out. The reason Blackbeard was successful was he was incredibly good at commanding his men. He had respect of his men, so much so that they literally died for him. Also, I want to note that, you know, the last years of Blackbeard's life, 60% of his crew were freed maroon slaves, which he got off that boat, which is La Concorde, or later rechristened Queen Anne's Revenge, because he had Jacobite tendencies. So here we have Johnny Depp returning with magic potions, because nothing kills pirates like magic potions.
Captain Teach, she's dying. You must save your daughter.
This one takes life. This one has the tear and gives life.
And everlasting life, not accurate. I mean, things like that are things that Spanish people used to tell each other about, you know, same things like El Dorado, I suppose. This was all of the myths surrounding pirates and magical places in the Americas were done by a lot of conquistadors, making themselves sound very exciting and, you know, noble.
You take it, father, for your soul.
So we don't know if Blackbeard had a daughter. There's references to the fact that he did. He certainly had more than one wife, because he'd have a wife in each port. So the likelihood is he had kids. Whether he acknowledged them or not is another matter. But I don't think this is quite the right age range, because he would have been about 38 when he died, and I don't think he was having kids when he was 10 years old. I mean, it was very useful to have wives in every port, and not just for like romantic reasons, but really you needed character witnesses. So if you were arrested, you needed somebody to be there at your trial who would say, oh, he's lovely, he's always good, he comes home. That's what you need in order that you might actually escape the gallows. So that is why it was very fortuitous to have, you know, families in every town if you can afford them, and Blackbeard could certainly afford them.
Angelica, save me, my child.
No.
I love you, father.
And then you've got this wonderful scene where once again Blackbeard is seen as being treacherous, and that's what kills him, so he deserves it really, when actually Blackbeard nearly destroys the man who came to kill him in his boat and jumps aboard thinking that the crew that he's just broadsided are dead, but actually they're hiding. So it's actually Maynard who was the treacherous one in the capture of Blackbeard, and he fought nobly to the death and then had his head cut off. Blackbeard certainly encouraged myths about himself. So I don't think he encouraged a myth that he could like strangle people with his own rigging, but he certainly didn't want people to think that he was a pushover. The last thing he wanted was a merchant vessel to see his flag and his fleet bearing down on them and think, I'll be all right, I'll outrun them, because he wanted them to fear him. Once they feared him, then he could easily take all the stuff and they wouldn't put up a fight. So fear was used, and that is why he dressed so elaborately in all black with like brace of pistols, and he set fire to his beard and that sort of thing. And he also, I think, encouraged this sort of idea that he was mad. He could have also been mad because of the syphilis, but it might also have been like, oh, he's crazy, what's he going to do next? He's unpredictable, he's manic. And that is certainly something he encouraged in order that merchant vessels feared him. The Government House, Port Royal, Jamaica, very well tended, very nice. That carriage looks a bit modern, I'd say, because that carriage looks like, 18th century at the earliest, and here we are in the 17th century, but the costumes are pretty good. Not sweaty enough for the boys.
Whom do you wish to see?
But he looks excellent. If you look at old portraits of Henry Morgan, he is seen as quite chunky. He was meant to be quite formidable and fit when he was younger, but now we've got a slightly chunkier man who's incredibly successful admiral at this point. He is an admiral and he's just taking over to be the governor of Jamaica.
I can appreciate your discomfort, my lord. It's not pleasant having a man you tried to hang return as your superior. But for the sake of the empire we both serve, I am willing to forget your distaste of me.
The ceremony making you official governor will take place tomorrow. I shall perform all duties required of me as an officer of the crown. But my personal life is my own, sir.
And it is true that other people, when he became governor, were very dismissive of him because he did act like a pirate lord in many senses.
Being governor is going to require some restraint. There's always Maracaibo.
Into your quarters, you blockheads, both of you!
What quarters, sir?
How do I know?
So Henry Morgan, it's debatable whether you count him as a pirate or as a privateer. He certainly did have a letter of marque to do all of his attacking, but he did attack a lot of towns, which wasn't really covered by the letter of marque. And when I say attack a lot of towns, he got the name of Drake in reference to Sir Francis Drake by the Spanish. He was really not liked by them. He destroyed cities. He was a bad man. If you're Spanish. If you're British, however, he's very useful.
No, you don't. That's mine. I saw it first.
Oh, listen, listen.
Now, this is interesting because we have here a representation of a black person on the island who's obviously a slave. And now, there's famously, before Jamaica fell to the British, it was Spanish. And on Jamaica, you have a lot of Spanish maroon slaves who continually fight the British, raiding the plantations when they're on there. This guy is obviously, he's also speaking very much like an American representation of slavery rather than a Caribbean one.
What are you doing here?
Oh, nothing, sir. Just going fast.
Stealing, eh?
Oh, no, sir. I was just looking for a locket that belonged to Miss Margaret, but it ain't here, sir. It ain't here.
So he hasn't got any of the early patois that's starting to come in, maybe. He hasn't got any African accents. He has certainly not been there long enough to have been born on that island. He's probably from Africa. So the fact that he's got a sort of, American accent's a bit weird. I mean, Henry Morgan was certainly very brutal when it came to attacking Spanish people. He would slaughter people, and he'd walk through the jungle with his men slaughtering people. He was an incredibly good commander. He could command, I think some attacks he did in Panama, he had over 2,000 men under his control. And he was incredibly good, and people would follow him. And the stories about him made him, not only formidable to hear about, you wanted to surrender, but also you'd want to follow him. And people, would make a fortune just from the share of the spoils. But he was a privateer, not a pirate, so he was doing this with permission of the governor of Jamaica, and so he was allowed to. And then obviously he became governor of Jamaica himself.
Majesty.
Oh, look at the 1930s ladies, how beautiful they are. And how beautiful that man is. I mean, sorry, but he really is. He's a very elegant. Anyway, at this time, Britain and Spain, not really getting along. Not really getting along at all, mainly because Britain was an upstart nation and Spanish people didn't recognise the Queen and thought that, taking over Britain, getting rid of them, would really please the Pope. So, and also stop their vessels being attacked by British pirates like Sir Francis Drake. So that is what was happening.
I have a more serious charge preferred against you. His Excellency Don Alvarez, ambassador to this court, states that you did attack, plunder, and sink the galleass Santa Eulalia, on which he was a passenger under the flag and protection of his sovereign, King Philip of Spain. Is this charge true?
Part of it, Your Grace. Quite a large part of it.
Part of it.
So there's this sort of real rivalry, even though, Britain at this time is this tiny little island and Spain dominates the globe. They're getting all the gold from the Americas. They're owning huge amounts of empire. So at this time, the British are the underdogs in this situation. And the Spanish really are the sort of the conquerors of the world.
Well, what's the rest?
We also set free many Englishmen, imprisoned as galley slaves on His Excellency's ship.
Your Grace, these men referred to by Captain Thorpe were duly tried and sentenced to the galley by a qualified court.
I submit, Your Grace, that the court of the Inquisition is not qualified to pass fair judgment on English seamen, nor to subject them to the cruelties of a Spanish galley.
Your Grace, it appears the captain wishes to justify what in plain words is a desire for plunder with no respect for the interests of Spain.
I also love the way that, he's sort of justifying himself. All of this would have been unspoken, particularly in front of the Spanish ambassador. I mean, the whole point of this scene is obviously to depict the British as very, very reasonable and in control and to, have the Spanish, as I said, they're at war with the world, because this is during the Second World War, and we're trying to convince the Americans to join Britain in the fight against the Germans who are at war with the world. So you've got to read a lot of sort of propaganda into this. But it's certainly the case that Elizabeth, when Drake came back from his circumnavigation of the world, he had attacked loads of Spanish vessels, and at that time Britain had made a very sort of hasty peace with Spain, and she sort of took the treasure behind closed doors and said, "Well done, love," but didn't really sort of celebrate him. And it wasn't until the Armada that he really sort of came in and he's really great at attacking Spanish people. So this sort of public display of, here she is, she's going to point her finger in a second, you wait.
Captain Thorpe, do you imagine that we are at war with Spain?
Your Grace, Spain is at war with the world.
Enough of this. Listen to me, every one of you. Never again will you dare, in my presence, to condone your crimes under the mask of patriotism. No more of such talk, do you hear? And for the future, let me warn you that any unwarranted attack upon the person or property of Spanish subjects would cost the guilty party his head. His head, is that clear?
That is all for the ambassador, because behind the scenes she was taking all the treasure and enjoying it very muchly. So Elizabeth, she is allowing men like Sir Francis Drake to go out in her name, been given a letter of marque, which is basically how James Bond has a license to kill. A letter of marque is you have a license to attack enemy ships. So people we're at war with, like Spain, like Portugal, you're allowed to go and raid any merchant vessel that you like. You've got permission. It's not piracy, it is patriotism. And piracy, you can keep the loot. Actually, if it's Elizabeth first, she wants a bit of it, but shh, backstage, don't tell the Spanish. It's fine. Right, but these ships aren't even close enough together yet. They would have been bumping together. The actual gunwales would have been really far apart. The sort of fences on either side of the deck would have been really far apart because ships sort of do this sort of shape. And so you're not going to get close enough. I mean, the Spanish Armada, they couldn't get close to the British ships because they would just broadside them. They literally turn their guns and fire at them. And it's very difficult to then sail a ship when your crew is covered in splinters below decks and dead. So, getting two ships to just line up is so much skill in the first place. But it did happen, historically it did happen. And you would use grappling hooks and you'd pull the ships together. But even, the ships would have to be touching. And what I love about this is you genuinely have loads of people I mean, these vessels would have had at least 300 men operating them, so this is nice. But again, they're too far apart. You'd be crushed before you hit the sea, surely. And it's ever so still. It is so still, but I love the hacking. The hacking is great. The pistols, once again, every single pistol seems to work, but the hitting of the back of the rifle is great. They have the galley oarsmen below. And you had this sort of swing. There were people who basically lived up in the rigging at this time, so that's pretty good. And I like the sort of cutlasses they've got here, the men are fighting with, falling into the sea, obviously. I mean, a bit slow, but, you know, considering that, and this is the thing, you don't want a long sword when you're fighting on a pirate ship, because it's going to get caught in the rigging, it's going to get caught on other people, there is no space.
Ship's sinking, Captain. Then we shall drown together.
And this sword is ridiculous. This is a dueling rapier. I mean, seriously, one guy could just snap that. It is not the sword for battle. This is the sword that gentlemen duel with, which is why the gentlemen are fighting each other like this. Like gentlemen on a boat. It's ridiculous. In a battle scene, you want a much thicker sword than that. If you look at Drake's sword, it was a rapier, but it was a thick one. This sort of idea that Elizabeth I, this noble people, we're just trying to defend ourselves and do what's right, is not what was happening. Elizabeth was trying to, you know, basically play two sides of the same coin. She was trying to not be at war with Spain, because she would lose, but also get loads of Spanish gold on the sly by giving men like Sir Francis Drake letters of marque to go and raid a few Spanish vessels. And that's what he did, and it wasn't as noble as it comes across in the film. Thank you for watching this video all about the history of pirates. I've been Iszi Lawrence, this has been History Hit. Check out all the other videos that they're popping up all around me. They are all excellent. Expand your mind, learn about history. It's fun.